And welcome back. Video number 2 of the endocrine system. Now in video part number 1, we talked about the functions of the endocrine system, how it compares and contrasts to the nervous system. And we spent a lot of time talking about the structure. So the glands, endocrine versus exocrine, and most particularly the hormones. We talked about 3 types of hormones. We talked about the peptide, the monoamine, and the steroid hormones. And we talked about whether each category is water or fat soluble, and then how hormones travel in the bloodstream, and then what happens when they get to the target cells. Yes. Okay, so that means that what's left for part 2 of the endocrine system is to go gland by gland. And we'll just talk about the gland, what hormones it releases, and what the functions are of each of these hormones. If you can imagine, for our last lecture exam and for the final exam, this information tends to be very straightforward. So you can imagine some matching. You can see on one side hormones and on the other side actions or functions, and you just match them up. You will see that on Blackboard there is a summary sheet of the hormones. It's a nice big table which allows you to kind of neatly put together what you need to know. Here are the glands, and then you can fill in what hormones they release, and you can fill in what the functions are of those hormones. And that will make you smile and then get a good grade on our remaining exams. Trying to make you smile here. All right, so we're going to start from the top, the superior part of the body, and we're going to work our way down. Okay, so our first gland is going to be the hypothalamus. We've talked about the hypothalamus before in the nervous system, so we know where it is. The hypothalamus is right there in the brain. What I want to point out is the hypothalamus is up here, and hanging down from it are the pituitary glands. So we're going to talk about the pituitary glands next, but these two work together. So we can't talk about one without the other. Hypothalamus, and hanging down from the hypothalamus are the pituitary glands, anterior and posterior. There's going to be a lot of information on these slides, but I'm going to point out what you need to know. So, for example, for the hypothalamus, right now, just make sure you know where it is. It's in the brain. Know that hanging down from it are the pituitary glands. And as we said before in the first video, remember, the endocrine system doesn't have one master control center. The nervous system has the brain. What a great master control center. But the endocrine system doesn't have a master control center. However, even in the absence of having a master control center, the hypothalamus, because it oversees the pituitary glands, and because the pituitary glands secrete the most hormones out of any of the glands, the hypothalamus tends to have the most influence over glands. So there's no master control center, but we could say that the hypothalamus has the largest control over other glands. Look at that. Okay. Let me just go ahead for a minute because I think I want to, let's see, anterior. Oh, did you guys hear that? My cat just jumped up on the table. Hi there, Kima. Okay. Her name is Kima. I'm a big fan of The Wire. If you've been in my office at work, I have a big poster of The Wire, the TV show on HBO. And there's a character, Kima Griggs. Detective Kima Griggs, Baltimore City homicide. All right, Kima, there you go. Oh, there she jumped off. The fun of working from home. I'm sure you all have similar things that are happening as you're studying from home. All right, it's not written on this slide, but let's just go ahead and do it while we're talking about it. What I want to talk about is, let's let's go to blue. The hypothalamus actually produces two hormones. So let's just be very clear and write this down. The hypothalamus produces two hormones. And those hormones are listed up here. Oxytocin and our good old friend ADH. Here's the thing. The hypothalamus produces these hormones, but these hormones are secreted into the bloodstream by the posterior pituitary gland. So if we imagine oxytocin and ADH are produced in the hypothalamus, but these hormones travel down to the posterior pituitary gland, and these hormones are released from the posterior pituitary gland. So this is kind of tricky. So if I were to ask you, where are ADH and oxytocin produced? ADH and oxytocin are produced in the hypothalamus. If I were to ask you, where are these hormones released from into the bloodstream? Oxytocin and ADH are released into the bloodstream by the posterior pituitary gland. Nice and clear. Okay, so as we said, we have the pituitary glands that hang down from the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is up here, and of course, hanging down from them, yes, they do kind of resemble testes. Hanging down from them would be the anterior pituitary gland and posterior pituitary gland. Other names from these would be the adenohypophysis, another name for anterior pituitary gland, and neurohypophysis, another name for posterior pituitary gland. The stalk that connects the two is called the infundibulum. It's a really hard word to say, and I probably don't say it right still. But the stalk that connects the pituitary glands to the hypothalamus is called the infundibulum. Here's a nice little reminder, not going to be on any test in A&P 2, but we always got to draw the connections, at least I do. You may remember from A&P 1, there was a structure on the ethmoid bone that the pituitary glands rest in. Oh yes, I know you all remember it. Sella turcica. That was a little depression that housed the pituitary glands to protect them. But this is not going to be on your exam. All right. Here we go, jumping right into some of the hard stuff. Look at you being so excited. I can tell, even though I can't see you. We talked about portal systems. And we talked about the fact that a portal system is when you have arteries that come down, leading to one capillary bed, and then leads to another capillary bed before leaving for the veins, right? That's what a portal system is. A blood vessel circulatory route where we have two capillary beds. There are only two places in the body where we have a portal system. One of them we discussed in the digestive system, and I also mentioned it in the blood vessels, the hepatic portal system. Just took a drink, pardon me. The other one is right here, hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. You can really just say it's a portal system between the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands. We have the anterior pituitary gland, excuse me, and we have a posterior pituitary gland. As you can tell, we have two capillary beds. There is one capillary bed here between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. And there is a second capillary bed in the posterior pituitary gland. And then some of the veins that connect them are the portal veins. Now, depending on depending on what you read about this, Even though if you look at this, it shows two capillary beds, one here and one here. I think it's easier to talk about the two capillary beds being one capillary bed in the hypothalamus and then another series of capillary beds in the pituitary glands. So functionally, we're going to talk about this one. Functionally, even though we see on the left here, we have kind of a connection between the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland and then a separate capillary bed into the posterior pituitary gland. Let's talk about the functional relationship. And the functional relationship is that we have a portal system of two capillary beds, one in the hypothalamus, and we tend to talk about it as the second capillary bed being in the anterior pituitary gland. So I'm going to put anterior pituitary gland. So let's define it this way. That's why I'm putting stars. The hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system is a series where we have two capillary beds. One capillary bed is in the hypothalamus, and the second capillary bed is in the anterior pituitary gland. And of course, the portal veins are what connect these two capillary beds. So focus on what I said over here. Good. Let me go ahead because I want to try and wrap this up now. Yes. Okay. I skipped ahead to slide 36. I know I really skipped ahead quickly, but I just want to wrap this up while we're talking about it, and then we're going to go back. So it tends to be that the hypothalamus, right? Hypothalamus is up here. The hypothalamus, as we know, oversees the pituitary glands. But it does so in different ways to the anterior pituitary gland versus to the posterior pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus oversees the anterior pituitary gland in a different way than it oversees the posterior pituitary gland. Let me change colors so we don't get so monotone. The connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland is done via blood vessels. So the hypothalamus communicates and in that way oversees the anterior pituitary gland through the blood vessels of the portal system. So like we just talked about, the portal system tends to be between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. Just ignore everything else on this slide except for what I'm writing and what I'm trying to make as clear as possible. The hypothalamus oversees the anterior pituitary gland by communicating with it through blood vessels or the portal system. On the other hand, maybe I'll change colors again. What color should I choose now? Let's do green. I like green. On the other hand, the hypothalamus communicates with the posterior pituitary gland via nerve impulses. So it's different. The hypothalamus communicates with the posterior pituitary gland via nerve impulses, whereas the hypothalamus communicates to the anterior pituitary gland via blood vessels, chemicals secreted through the blood. All right. This can be a little bit tricky. I'm obviously trying to narrow it down because there's so much we could say. This picture actually, if we go back, does a pretty good job of showing you that difference. So remember, the hypothalamus communicates with the anterior pituitary gland via blood vessels. But the hypothalamus oversees and communicates with the posterior pituitary gland through nerve impulses. And that's what these green things are. They're showing you nerve impulses. So the hypothalamus communicates with the posterior pituitary gland through nerve impulses. All right. Now, let's talk about the pituitary glands. Let's get into it. For each gland, there are many, many, many hormones that it may release. I don't think it's useful to ask you to memorize every single hormone in the body. So instead, I have starred the hormones that I would like you to know. So our first example of this is the anterior pituitary gland. It releases in total 7 hormones. You only have to know 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'd like you to know the thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and growth hormone. Let's talk about these. Okay, the follicle stimulating hormone, and you may have heard of these, FSH, and then luteinizing hormone, LH. These are hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary gland, and they travel all the way down to the reproductive organs. So you'll need to know for each of these what the target organs or target cells are, as well as the actions. So let's talk about each of these. Let's do follicle stimulating hormone. The target organs or target cells for FSH are the primary sex organs, ovaries in women, testes in men. And what is the function? Stimulates development of either eggs or sperm. And we'll talk about these hormones more in the reproductive chapter, particularly for the women, for the females. So follicle stimulating hormone goes to the ovaries or testes and it stimulates the follicles, which either in the female, they're actually called follicles that produce the egg. In the male, it is the seminiferous tubules that produce the sperm. Then we have luteinizing hormone. Let me circle that, okay? Luteinizing hormone also goes down to the primary sex organs, but it has a different function. Luteinizing hormone in males tells the testes to secrete testosterone. In the case of the females, luteinizing hormone stimulates ovulation when the egg is released, and it stimulates secretion of estrogen. So you could actually summarize this in part, and we could say that luteinizing hormone causes a release of the sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone. An additional function for luteinizing hormone is that midway through the monthly sexual cycle of a female, it will cause the egg to be released from the ovary, which is ovulation. Just imagine matching or a simple, what is the function of luteinizing hormone in men? And then you'll see A, B, C, D. So not trying to trick you here. Try and keep it as straightforward as possible. Let's talk about thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. That was one I circled, right? Yeah, okay. Just want to make sure. Thyroid stimulating hormone. This is also released from the anterior pituitary gland, but this time it goes to the thyroid. And the thyroid gland is surrounds the trachea in the throat. And as the name suggests, the thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete its own hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid gland and tells it to release its own hormone, which we're going to find out later is thyroid hormone. A couple other things I want to point out while we're on this slide. Look at the far-reaching effects of the anterior pituitary gland. And even though it's cut off here, we can't forget that luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone went to the ovaries and testes. So this small gland in the brain, anterior pituitary gland, this small gland in the brain releases hormones that go all throughout the body, all the way down to the testes and ovaries, to the adrenal gland above the kidneys, to the liver, to the muscles, to the bones, to the mammary glands, to the thyroid. So it's pretty amazing. You can also see kind of a domino effect that we have many, I feel like I need to write here. We have many other glands that will only release their hormones when they get input from another hormone. And we've talked about a couple examples already. We talked about luteinizing hormone and thyroid hormone. we talked about luteinizing hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone. So in other words, the thyroid gland and the testes and ovaries will only secrete their hormones if they get a message from the other hormone first. So it can get very complicated. Lastly, I want to talk about growth hormone. I've used this as an example all throughout this system. Released from the anterior pituitary gland, goes to muscles, bone. I picked on those two because they're the most common, and they promote growth. No one should miss that one. You can see here that sometimes growth hormone works directly. For example, growth hormone can work directly on the liver or directly on the muscles and bones. But growth hormone can also work indirectly by causing the release of insulin-like growth factor, or IGF. But you don't have to know that. It's just an extra. You can read about some things that relate to this. I am not going to talk about this on any exam. There are some interesting things here. Obviously, when we're younger, we're going to have larger amounts of growth hormone because we're still growing. Or potentially after an injury or after tissue damage, we're going to have a release of more growth hormone. Something else to note, again, not going to be on the test. Growth hormone levels fluctuate throughout the day. They're higher during sleep and right in the morning. For my dissertation, I assessed 7 different hormones through a blood test. And the reason why we had to do it first thing in the morning was because of one of the hormones I was looking at was IGF, which is an offshoot of growth hormone. So you have to measure at the same time because levels will naturally of growth hormone and IGF fluctuate throughout the day. All right, let's talk about the posterior pituitary gland. So, as we know, these 2 hormones are actually produced in the hypothalamus, but they just happen to be released from the posterior pituitary gland. These 2 hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, produced in the hypothalamus, travel down to the posterior pituitary gland where they're released from. You already know about ADH. Goes to the kidneys, that's the target organ or target cells, and this is our water-retaining hormone. See, some of these you already know. Don't even have to worry about it. One that might be new to you is oxytocin. Oxytocin, particularly in women, obviously, during childbirth, stimulates the uterus to contract. So you only need to function on the functions that I'm pointing out. Because when I ask questions about these, I'll be asking questions based off of what I'm underlining and starring. This is another look at how the hypothalamus and then the pituitary glands that it oversees, all the wide-ranging effects. The hypothalamus and the pituitary glands interact with the most organs throughout the body. Pretty crazy. I mentioned how the anterior pituitary gland is communicated with by the hypothalamus via blood vessels, portal system, and the posterior pituitary gland communicates with the hypothalamus, vice versa, via nerve impulses. That's all you need to know. You can read about some pituitary disorders. I'm not going to ask you about these, just some extra stuff. All right, moving on down, although I guess we could really say laterally. Our next gland is the pineal gland. Some say pineal, I say pineal. Say it how you want. This is part of the epithalamus, which, if you remember, is kind of in this inner part of the brain. We had the thalamus in the middle, the hypothalamus down here, but behind it is the epithalamus. And what I've just circled in, no, I didn't. That is where the pineal gland is. It's in the epithalamus. So I'm going to put location, epithalamus. One of the hormones released by the pineal gland is melatonin, which I'm sure you've heard of. And one of the functions of melatonin is regulating our circadian rhythm or sleep-wake cycle or biological clock. You can actually buy melatonin pills or melatonin or a little solution with melatonin. Some people will try that to get them to sleep better. But it's produced naturally in the pineal gland of the epithalamus. Let's move on down. So here we have the thymus gland. And I want you to be careful because the thymus is different from the thyroid, which we're going to talk about later, next. The thyroid gland is the one that you're more familiar with, probably, and the thyroid gland is the one that sits over the trachea. The thymus, on the other hand, the thymus is right above the heart. If you remember, if you were so fortunate as to be the one dissecting the thoracic cavity of the cat that we did in lab earlier this semester, right above the heart was some glandular tissue that you had to clear away, and that was actually the thymus gland. So its location is right above the heart. The hormones that it releases are thymosins. Don't you love that it sounds just like the gland? The thymus gland secretes thymosins. Perfect. And what the thymosin hormones do is they work on T cell maturation. And they also regulate when T cells are released. I'm about to bring it all full circle. Buckle your seatbelts, because we talked about this in the blood chapter way back at the beginning of the semester before we even knew there was going to be a pandemic. We said that white blood cells, like red blood cells, white blood cells are produced in the red bone marrow. We know that. But then some white blood cells have to travel to the thymus gland for further maturation. And of course, the white cells we're talking about are the T cells. T cells are produced in the red bone marrow, but they go to the thymus gland for maturation. And what's going to help mature these T cells and then regulate their release? Hormones called thymosins. You should also review that the thymus gland is larger in children, but it most definitely shrinks with age. In an elderly person, you may see little to no thymus gland at all. And this should make sense to you. When we're younger, our body is busy building its immune system. So it's no surprise that as we get older, we have all the T cells produced already, for the most part. So we don't need as much activity. And when a gland or any part of the body is not working as much, it will get smaller. And lastly, on the bottom here are sweetbreads. Maybe you've heard of them if you watch Top Chef like I do. Sweetbreads can be any kind of animal organ meat, but people, most often sweetbreads refer to the thymus gland. So look at that delicious on the right, thymus gland of a cow. Yummy. All right, now we're going to talk about the thyroid. So the thyroid, not the thymus, be careful. The thyroid gland is the one that's located in the neck. We know that. This is actually the largest endocrine gland. The pancreas is the largest gland overall, but remember the pancreas is an exocrine gland. So the largest endocrine gland is the thyroid. Pretty big. And we're going to talk about two hormones that are released from the thyroid gland, thyroxine and calcitonin. You should know both. Okay. Thyroxine, this is probably what you're most familiar with. Thyroxine is the hormone produced and released by the thyroid gland that will increase metabolic rate. If someone has hyperthyroidism, their overall body's metabolic rate will be high because their thyroid gland is releasing more thyroxine to boost metabolic rate even more. If someone has hypothyroidism, their thyroid gland isn't releasing enough thyroxine, so their metabolic rate is too slow. But maybe what you didn't know is that the thyroid gland also releases a hormone called calcitonin. And as the name suggests, this is a hormone that helps to regulate blood calcium levels. But more importantly, because we're going to talk about another hormone that regulates blood calcium levels, calcitonin is released, secreted, when blood calcium is too high, and it stimulates the osteoblasts. We're going to have a slide on this in a minute, but these are the things that you should be reviewing or writing down on your little summary sheet, okay? Calcitonin regulates blood calcium levels. More specifically, calcitonin is released when blood calcium is too high, and it will stimulate the osteoblasts. You can read about some thyroid gland disorders. The only one that don't know how that happened. Okay. The only one that I want to point out would be a goiter. A goiter happens when there is an enlarged thyroid gland. We don't tend to see it in the United States very often. One thing that we didn't talk about was, in order for the thyroid gland to do its thing, a person has to be ingesting or getting enough iodine. If, let's say, you had a diet where you were not getting enough iodine, your thyroid would not be able to do its job well enough. And what would happen in response, because there's not enough iodine, the thyroid gland is going to start to work overtime or triple time to try and work harder to make up for the fact it doesn't have enough iodine. And it can literally be a goiter. And actually, this whole thing is the thyroid gland. Isn't that wild? It can become that enlarged. But usually not a problem in this country because we tend to get plenty of iodine. Iodine comes in seafood and certain vegetables, milk and eggs, but also our good old friend sea salt. If you get the good old-fashioned Morton's container of sea salt, it is iodized. So they put it in the sea salt. We get plenty of iodine. Now, let's talk about the lesser-known parathyroid glands. The thyroid gland on the anterior side of the body gets all the credit. It's on the front. It's big. However, embedded on the back of the thyroid gland are 4 little nodules, collectively known as the parathyroid glands. Okay? On the back of the thyroid gland, 4 little nodules, they're shown here as yellow, collectively known as the parathyroid glands. These release, wait for it, parathyroid hormone. Named just like the gland. It makes it so easy. And this also regulates blood calcium levels, but it's the opposite of calcitonin released from the thyroid gland. So in this case, parathyroid hormone is released when blood calcium levels are low, and it stimulates the osteoclasts. That's just going to be some memorization. We talked about this in A&P1, at least I did. I'm sure you did too, no matter who you had for A&P1, if it was me or somebody else. So now we can fill in the hormones. And let me go back. Didn't like that one. Got cut off. Okay, so as we said, we have calcitonin as one of our hormones that regulates blood calcium levels. And then we have parathyroid hormone, which we can abbreviate as PTH, parathyroid hormone. Collectively, these work to regulate blood calcium, which is a really big deal. I talked about this in the fluid balance chapter. Calcium, everybody thinks about calcium with the Flintstone vitamins. Keeps your bones strong. It does keep the bones strong. And this is where we store calcium, but some of that calcium leaves the bone to circulate in the bloodstream. And that we need to have a constant amount of calcium in the bloodstream, because that is what's going to enable our muscles to use some calcium to be able to contract. Nerve impulses to grab some calcium when they want to send a nerve impulse. Glands, many glands need calcium in order to secrete hormones. Blood clotting needs calcium. So it's very important that we have enough, not too much, but not too little, blood calcium in the blood. So here we have calcium homeostasis, nice and level, what it should look like. Look at that. But what if we have too much calcium? If we have too much calcium, we're going to release calcitonin. So calcitonin is released when blood calcium is too high. When calcitonin is released, it's going to stimulate osteoclasts. If blood calcium is too high, osteoclasts break down bone. Wait a minute. Calcitonin is... Yeah, blood calcium, I'm having a moment here. Blood calcium's too high. We want to stimulate the osteoblast. See, I knew I wasn't having that right. Oh dear. We're all imperfect beings, aren't we? I know it didn't sound right. Osteoblasts. Thank you. There we go. Yes. So if blood calcium's too high, we're going to release calcitonin, and calcitonin stimulates the osteoblasts. Remember, osteoblasts build bone. So if my initial problem is too much blood calcium, my bone, in order to build bone, the bone is going to take calcium out of the bloodstream into the bone to build bone. So osteoblasts will take calcium out of the blood, bring it into the bone to build bone. And by taking calcium out of the blood, it's lowering blood calcium back to normal. And then, of course, the opposite will be true. If blood calcium levels start to drop, we're going to release parathyroid hormone, which stimulates the osteoclasts. If our problem is too little blood calcium, then I stimulate the osteoclast because that breaks down bone. And when I break down bone, I'm releasing calcium into the bloodstream. All right. Now we're going to jump all the way down to the adrenal glands. The fun never ends around here. The adrenal glands sit on top of the kidney. They look like little tiny hats. And what's funny about them is the adrenal gland, it does secrete some hormones that can affect the kidneys, but most of the hormones that are released by the adrenal gland don't even function with the kidneys at all. So it's just kind of, I'm not sure why this happens to sit on top of the kidneys. It just does. All right, so we're going to talk about the adrenal gland in two parts. The adrenal medulla. We know medulla means inner region. So the inner region here is called the adrenal medulla, and the adrenal cortex is the outer region. Outer region is the adrenal cortex. And these different regions secrete different hormones. Let's go one by one. Let's talk about the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, that's the inner region, this secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. I have talked about these already in this chapter as the catecholamines. And epinephrine, norepinephrine are tricky little buggers because epinephrine and norepinephrine function as both hormones, like they do here, but epi and norepinephrine also function as neurotransmitters in the nervous system. So they can function as both. And what that really means is that we just get a double whammy of epinephrine and norepinephrine in the short term and in a longer term, which is good because they do a lot for us. Think about epinephrine and norepinephrine as functioning to increase our sympathetic nervous system response. This is our fight or flight. So no matter if epi and norepinephrine are released as hormones or neurotransmitters, their function is basically the same. There's a couple slight differences, but for our purposes, we're just going to say they're the same, no matter if these are released as hormones or as neurotransmitters. Fight or flight. We know what this does. Come on. Increases heart rate, blood pressure, but decreases activity to the GI tract and the kidneys. So this is our fight or flight, our short-term response to stress. And our short-term response to stress. Stress could mean having a gun held to your head, or sometimes stress could be something like exercise. Exercise tends to be a good stress, but it's still a stress to the body, and we still want to increase heart rate, don't we? Yes. Okay. You'll see up top here, if you wanted to look at the catecholamines, the adrenal medulla, 85% of what the adrenal medulla releases is epinephrine, whereas the remaining 15% of what the adrenal medulla secretes is norepinephrine, but I'm not going to ask you that. So think of the adrenal medulla, the inner part of the adrenal gland. The adrenal medulla is our short-term response to stress, norepinephrine. On the other hand, we're going to classify the adrenal cortex hormones as our body's long-term response to stress. So the adrenal medulla, norepinephrine, those hormones function in our short-term response to stress. But the adrenal cortex, which is our outer region, secretes cortisol and aldosterone. These are the two hormones I'm going to ask you to know. And these are both related to our body's long-term response to stress. We already know about aldosterone. This is our salt-retaining hormone. In terms of blood pressure regulation and electrolyte balance, aldosterone is very important. So in a long-term response to stress, think about dehydration. Wouldn't that be a stress to the body? Absolutely. So in a long-term response to stress, we often need to regulate our blood pressure and blood volume, and we will rely on aldosterone, salt-retaining hormone, released from the adrenal cortex. And we will also release cortisol. Cortisol is our body's natural anti-inflammatory. So in response to stress, let's say you did exercise, you won't be releasing cortisol during the exercise session very much because it's not a short-term response to stress. But after the exercise session, when you're at home recovering, you will absolutely be releasing cortisol. It's our natural anti-inflammatory. Maybe you've heard of a cortisone shot. A cortisone shot is given for some kind of long-term inflammatory injury, like a tendinitis, for example. Cortisone is a synthetic form of cortisol. All right, so the adrenal glands, our short-term response to stress, adrenal medulla, norepinephrine. Our long-term response to stress, the adrenal cortex, aldosterone, and cortisol. You can read about the adrenal gland disorders, but this will not be on the test. All right, let's talk about the pancreas. The pancreas, we already know, is an organ that functions in two different systems. So we know that the pancreas secretes digestive enzymes that help us with digestion. However, the pancreas is also part of the endocrine system. But this is our only example that we've talked about of an exocrine gland. Remember, an exocrine gland releases its hormones into a duct, main pancreatic or accessory pancreatic duct. So this is an exocrine gland. And the hormones released by the pancreas into the pancreatic duct would be the insulin and glucagon. Make sure you review these. You should hopefully have some knowledge, at least you've heard of these before. Let's just make sure that you know what you need to know. Insulin is released when blood sugar is high. When blood sugar is too high, the pancreas will release insulin. It goes to the liver. So the liver is going to be the primary target organ that we talk about. Some people get this confused, and I can understand why. Insulin and glucagon are produced in the pancreas, but their target, both of their target organs, are the liver. So insulin is released when blood glucose is too high. Glucagon is released when blood glucose is too low. What do? Well, insulin, if blood sugar is too high, this is going to stimulate the liver to store sugar. If I have too much blood sugar, I can get rid of some of that blood sugar by storing the sugar in the liver. And what do I store sugar as? Glycogen. On the other hand, if I haven't eaten for a while, so also have a look at when these would be likely to be released. Insulin is likely to be released after you eat, because after you eat, you're probably going to have more blood glucose because your food had sugar in it. Glucagon is likely to be released between meals or if you haven't eaten for a while, because it's more likely that between meals is when your blood glucose will drop. And how does glucagon work? Well, if blood glucose gets too low, that glucagon is released from the pancreas, goes to the liver, tells the liver to release sugar. So it will release stored sugar. Okay, very straightforward here, all right? Make sure you review the absolute basics of diabetes. I mean, this is a topic we could talk about for a long time. As I've talked about from the beginning of this course, this is really a course about foundational human anatomy and physiology and how things should work. We leave the pathologies to later in your academic or professional careers. But this is such an important thing. Have a basic idea. Type 1 diabetes is usually caused by a lack of insulin. This is an autoimmune disease. This tends to be genetic. Again, I'm pointing out the most important things for you to know. Type 2 diabetes is likely caused by the fact that the target cells are no longer responsive to insulin. So you may have insulin. So in type 2 diabetes, these people have some insulin, but it's just that the tissues are not responsive to it. So even though we have insulin, what good does it do if our tissues are not responsive to it? This can be somewhat genetic, but this is more likely due to lifestyle habits. In other words, poor diet, no exercise. Okay, that's all you need to know. I'm going to keep it very simple. You can read about the pathology of diabetes. I will not ask you these questions. Suffice it to say that over the long term, when we have excess sugar in our bloodstream, it leads to a whole bunch of problems. It can lead to circulation problems, problems with your vision and the retina. It can make you much more likely to get cardiovascular disease and a whole host of other things. But I'm not going to ask you that specifically. You can see, and these are pretty much outdated by now, but you can see some charts that show you the rise. That rise has continued in the incidence of diabetes and what types of race and gender they're more likely to happen in. Extra information, not on the test. All right. This may be my favorite cartoon of the whole semester. All right. Now we are at our most inferior part of the body where there's glands, and that would be the primary sex organs, the ovary and the testes. Let's talk about these on the home stretch here. Okay, let's talk about women, the ovary. The ovary produces estrogen and progesterone. Now, before I even talk about this, I want to remind you of the anterior pituitary gland. So remember up in the brain, the anterior pituitary gland? It released follicle-stimulating hormone. So before we even, it also releases luteinizing hormone, So the activity of the ovary can't even get started until these hormones from the anterior pituitary gland make their way all the way down to the ovary. But that's a review, because we already talked about that. So let's just talk about the ovary and these hormones and what the functions of these hormones are. Estrogen stimulates egg production. It also stimulates female reproductive development, which means development of the female sexual organs. Estrogen also regulates the menstrual cycle. But let's just talk about estrogen. Stimulates egg production. Progesterone, it's so hard to keep this simple. We're going to say that progesterone regulates the menstrual cycle. Even though they both do, let's just start here. What we're going to find out in the next chapter on reproduction is that estrogen regulates the menstrual cycle by regulating egg production, which is the first half of the monthly cycle of a female. And then after the first half of the monthly cycle of the female, progesterone kicks in and regulates the menstrual cycle by increasing the thickness of the uterine wall to prepare for the fertilized egg during the second half of the monthly cycle for a female. So we'll just focus on those two functions. You can see down here, I'm not going to ask you this, but I know some of you overachievers, and that's fine, see this and want to know, so I'll just mention it even though it won't be on the test. After the initial follicle-stimulating hormone gets down to the ovaries at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, it then has to be suppressed. So there's a constant push and pull of these hormones. At the beginning of the month, we're going to have a release of FSH, which is going to stimulate the estrogen to produce the egg. But then, only after a certain period of time, then we want to have FSH inhibited so that progesterone can start to do its job. But please, for this chapter, stick to the basics. Think about matching. Think about what is the function of this hormone, ABCD. And go off of the functions that I'm talking about. Okay, in the male, of course, we talk about testosterone. And the functions of testosterone, it develops the male reproductive system, sustains sperm production. We'll talk about those two. I do want to point out that women also have some testosterone. Males also produce some estrogen. But of course, males will produce much more testosterone than females, and females will produce much more estrogen than males. All right, the end here, you do not have to know. I think that we've covered enough so that you can understand these without really having to memorize some extra words. What this is talking about is when we encounter stress, and again, that stress could be something that's kind of good, like exercise, or that stress could be something that we view as kind of bad, emotional stress, physical stress, that's bad. But in any case, once we experience stress, our body is going to respond by activating the autonomic nervous system, mostly the sympathetic nervous system, and of course the endocrine system, because, I've said it so many times, what two body systems regulate our overall body and therefore would be most important to regulate stress? The nervous system and the endocrine system. So you can look at these and see what specific hormones might be activated in our initial response to stress, our kind of moderate time response to stress, and then our long-term response to stress. But I'm not going to ask you these specifically. The last thing that you have to know was on this slide. Alrighty, one more chapter to go, everyone. Keep working. Good job.